Hello. In this science video, I have a treat for those of you who like large stations. Before I get ahead of myself, what are we going to be doing? Well, I'm going to be looking at what happens to station designs when we use maglev trains instead of using the normal railway locomotives. Now, maglev trains are much faster and much more powerful than the default railway locomotives. So I expect, before I start this experiment, two differences. So firstly, I expect hills to just make no difference. So station designs which get a bonus from hills are not going to get a bonus when we have maglevs. I also expect, because the maglevs are so fast, that the time they spend in platforms is going loading and unloading is going to be much greater compared to the time that they spend out on the tracks. So I think stations with more platforms might have an advantage. But first, let's have a look at the station designs that I'm going to test. So I'm going to avoid things which I know are going to be bad. Let's test station designs that we only know are good. So we have the compact PBS terminus, a simple but high throughput station. We have the compact semi-balanced RhomboRoRo, a compact and very high throughput station. We have the Thanks I Hate It station, a station that you build when you need that last little bit of throughput, or you're on a multiplayer server and you just want everyone else to suffer. We have the Rule Breaker, a slightly higher throughput terminus at the cost of requiring slightly more space. And then finally we have something new. And I have to apologise in advance to all my viewers who are not native speakers. No, this is not an English word. This is something silly I have made up. The RhomboRoRo. A roll-on, roll-off station in the shape of a rhombus. And this I've created because I think that when we have the maglevs, I think this will start performing rather better. But let's have a look at the performance that we have right now. So, we have the compact terminus. That's doing 1471 tons, which is a good number, and obviously not the highest. The compact semi-balanced is doing exactly what we are used to, which is sort of just short of 1900 tons, 1887. The Thanks I Hate It is making our life awful by just being outrageously good at 1971, the highest throughput station with these trains. Then the Rule Breaker, which is providing its usual boost over and above the compact terminus. That's at 1594. And then finally the RhomboRoRo, which with these extra platforms is getting a little bit of a boost over the compact SBR, but it's not quite as good as the Thanks I Hate It. That's doing 1915 tons, about 1900, if we want to round it down. Those are the results with trains. Let's now take a look at what happens when we exchange them for maglevs. So here we are with something that looks familiar and yet also different. Yes, it is the bold future stylings of the maglev. We see that these stations are operating in much the same way. There's no surprises really here, or even here. Things just look a bit faster. The Rule Breaker is slightly more interesting, because we can see that the behaviour which we had with slower trains, where they would release evenly, and they would enter the stations evenly, is no longer happening. Even though there's lots of wood there for these to load, they leave at quite different times, so this may have lost its advantage of its rule breaking. And then finally down here, the RhomboRoRo, and anybody who's good at geometry, don't mention that it in fact is a parallelogram, not a rhombus, because the sides are not of equal length. this seems to be doing fairly well. And we can see that the extra platform is actually getting used. That train was arriving as one was leaving there. Let's have a look at how those did scores-wise. So, we could open this up. And remember, the first thing to see here is the numbers are much larger. Across the board, we see larger numbers. So the compact PBS terminus, which was kind of just below 1500 with railway, is now happily up at 2042, slightly over 2000 tons. So this even by itself, if you only had one forest, would be able to handle the maximum production and maximum station rating without problems. The compact semi-balanced has gone up hugely. It's gone up from 1900 to nearly 3000, 2996 tons. So this, even this small station, could handle a quite sort of busy secondary industry. The thanks I hate it, well, finally you have a good gameplay-based reason to hate it, because it actually does less throughput than the compact semi-balanced. Not by a huge amount, but these hills are not providing any advantage, and we're losing out from this longer signal gap here. The rule breaker, well, it has no advantage over the compact terminus. It's producing, in fact, it's doing slightly less well, so may as well not build that. So for these 4 stations, the conclusion there is that for maglevs, things become simpler, because there's only 2 real station designs that we need to consider, which is the compact terminus and the semi-balanced RhomboRoRo. This meddling about with hills and troughs isn't needed, and this meddling about lots of clever entrances and exits isn't needed. But there's something I haven't mentioned, which is the RhomboRoRo. This is doing 3,500 tons. So this actually now, with the maglevs, is the best station design. And this is what I expected, that having more platforms would help. So knowing that this works better, what would happen if we extended this further and added even more platforms? Here we have a large version of our rhombus or parallelogram station, which can handle many more trains. And if we look at the throughput of this is now 4,500 tons. This actually requires, to keep the cargo going, to keep the cargo flowing into this, does actually require these 3 forests to be producing at their sort of highest possible capacity. So this, if you are building for maglevs, you'll see I've done the same at the other end. Building this larger station with more platforms is worthwhile. In fact, hugely worthwhile, where it was not the case for the trains, which were slower. But we can go further, because if we look at what's happening with this station, we can see some interesting things happening, which is trains waiting to come into the station, and something else which may be more obvious at the other end, which is the trains actually slowing down. So they enter the station. You see here, this has got a slightly longer entry path. And it's because as this train reaches the station, I'll show you maybe on here, should be nice and obvious, comes in at 400 miles per hour and has to slow to an immensely slow speed. And that actually causes quite a blockage here. So this station could be made even more efficient. Let's have a look at what we could do next. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that this was going to be somewhat pleasing for people who liked large stations. And here is the payoff. Let me go straight to the important point. This station throughputs 5,400 tons every month. And there's a couple of things here which we actually found were not good ideas for stations for slower trains, which now are good ideas. So the first thing you'll see is these braking tracks. You'll notice that compared to the previous design, where trains were often waiting in this entry track, that's not happening anymore, because these trains are coming in, and at the point where they slow down for their station entry, they're already fully in the track. So having that extra tile actually helps when the speed differential between the speed the train has to do at the last tile where it stops for the station versus the speed it's doing on the main line is so huge. For trains that are only doing 70 or 80 miles per hour, it doesn't matter so much. For trains that are doing 400, it matters an awful lot. And that is the same story around here. So, something interesting is happening here, which is the capacity of this line. So the maglev trains, one of the things that they really, really suffer from is if a train slows down somewhere around here, the train after it will catch up very, very quickly. Even with these huge headways that these trains have, it will catch up, and then it will have to stop. And then the same thing will happen all the way down the line. Now this merge here is important, because one of the things that will happen with standing waves on this track, and let me just introduce one. So I'm going to slow this train a little bit. And this train, you see, catches it up. And then the same with this train. And then the same with this train. And there's a little gap now. So this design has two features to help with standing waves. One is this escape track. You see it has this unsignaled escape track round here. And that means that standing waves cannot build up in this section, because if they build up in this section, the train goes down an alternative route. The other is that if the standing waves move backward, they come back to this merge, and ultimately they will congest this merge. Do you think, well, surely that is a bad thing if we congest this merging point? But what that means is that eventually we end up with a set of trains stopped here, which will all accelerate one after another, and then eventually the line will recover. So you'll see this here, you'll see this standing wave build up, and note now that train stops there. So all of these can now accelerate away, and that standing wave clears. And that effect of the standing waves, the ability to dispel them, makes a huge difference to the throughput of a maglev line. So that's what this big exit track is. And these merges are kind of an old trick which I copied from co-op saves, which is that trains are able to accelerate to full speed through here. And sometimes they will stop at these merging points because I don't have any priorities. But doing this gives the trains a greater chance that more of them will make it to full speed and not have to wait for each other. Whereas when we had the single exit track, almost all the trains had to wait for each other. And you will see here, this train will have to wait. So this isn't a bad point. But as we get round to here, so these trains, getting to a point, so there we go. This final set now, with these three trains, this train can go. This train can also accelerate to full speed. This train, I think, will just make it. It's possibly going to standing wave there. So that's where we're hitting the limits of a single track. So ultimately we will have standing waves because some trains can race around. But this is one of the most efficient ways to handle it, which is that we have a system for dispelling the standing waves here, and we have a system for allowing them to get back to a merge point here. So that is why this station gives an enormous throughput and is taking the output completely of two forests, most of a third, and in fact the fourth is there just so that when the ratings drop, this doesn't empty out. Now, to get more throughput, I think you would have to start considering either clever clocks and merges, so you had less headway on the trains, and less chance of them creating those standing waves, or you would be looking at starting to double track this, because that, and then sort of creating an even larger version of this station to take advantage of the double track. But that also would be a tremendous amount of materials being moved when you consider that this, even in its sort of, I can't really call this a basic form, this is quite a complex form, but even this still not enormous station is carrying 5,500 tons nearly of wood every month. And I hope that's been interesting. And our ultimate conclusion is that for most scenarios of maglevs, still sort of the staple stations, the compact PBS terminus and the compact semi-balanced RhomboRoRo remain very good stations. Meddling around with these sort of little optimizations becomes less worthwhile with these more powerful, faster trains. But also, by the same token, with those more powerful, faster trains, you do finally start to see the advantages of building these large station layouts.